Chen was dumped by his girlfriend, so it seems she wanted someone with more money. The protagonist has been left several times until he gets a system that gives him 90 billion to spend. However, it can only be with girls. The story begins with our protagonist Chen. It was already very late at night when a notification suddenly arrived on his phone. As he was looking, he was crying loudly because of a broken heart. There he saw a message from his ex-girlfriend, who firmly suggested that they break up. After rolling a few tears, our protagonist began typing a message at a very fast speed, asking his ex-girlfriend Tong about what happened. Chen asked if Tong and his roommates had decided to play truth or dare, and in the messages begged Tong not to do that to him. The young man's feelings for this girl are more than serious. After sending endless messages, he started asking his ex-girlfriend what he had done wrong, and if he wasn't good enough, even wrote saying that he had already planned his future. Chen's next message was that they would have a wonderful family, 2 beautiful children, a car, and a house. The protagonist assured Tong that he would make every effort to bring it to life. Dripping with snot and tears, Chen needs to type the last message, then asked Tong if it was really because he couldn't buy her a bag. After that, he said that he was saving money to be able to buy the bag next month. However, this message was not sent. Instead, Chen received a notification from the system that Tong had restricted the number of people who could send his messages. It was also reported there that once Tong accepts Chen's request as a friend, they will be able to communicate. At this moment, his roommate came over and said loudly that brother Chen seemed to be out of his mind today. Covered in drops of cold sweat, that young man smiled slightly and asked for genuine forgiveness for upsetting him. Suddenly, the protagonist slammed his fist the table and dropped the chair in anger, then left the dorm slamming the door. His surprised roommates continued to stare at the door. One of them asked the other if Chen had been abandoned again. The second replied firmly that this month was the 6th time this had happened. The roommates were arguing about the young man, and one of them even called him a stalker. The other agreed, adding that Chen had been chasing Tong for 3 years. After some time, the protagonist meets his ex-girlfriend. She asks him not to do anything because people are watching, to which Chen nervously smiled and turned to her saying that he understands that she is angry. But he bought his favorite fried pork. He begged Tong not to talk about the breakup anymore, and says that if she doesn't like something about him, then she can always tell that he will change. At this moment, 2 girls who were nearby were discussing what one of them had heard about Chen. One said that the proto worked 4 jobs at the same time to be able to give gifts to Tong. Another girl asked what the result was in the end because Tong left Chen anyway. Tong turned to Chen and said that she wasn't angry with him. And then, with a cautious tone in her voice, the girl announced that her Tong explained that after much thought he came to the conclusion that he really needed that guy more, and that Chen was just a friend. In shock and out loud, the protagonist asked the girl about that ex of hers, calling him by his first name, Wang Shanghai. Then he started asking how she did it. He stopped in the middle of the sentence and reminded Tong that this Wang is still a bad person, and asked if she forgot how this guy had cheated her. He ended by saying that Tong is again letting Wang spray his brain. At this time, a Mercedes arrived, in which a smug Wang was sitting, telling Tong to get into the car. After opening the car door, the girl turned to Chen and said that it was best for them not to meet again, as her boyfriend might not understand. After these words, the car immediately left Chen, who stood in place and watched the car with a sad look. After a certain period of time, he went to the supermarket and drank water, wondering why no one appreciates sincerity, and why he is so useless. After squeezing the water bottle, he decides that there was nothing wrong with him. His eyes lit up with a bright red light, and the young man himself smiled confidently, deciding for himself that it was only necessary to do it correctly, and then he would become not a sick man often, but a real winner. Suddenly, he heard a notification sound and froze when he saw a yellow sign in front of him. On that sign was a message that the Defender's strongest system had identified a passing candidate for the role of host. The following system board notified the young man that the connection was successful. Suddenly, a system board appeared above Chen's head with information about himself, which included his name, personal funds in the form of 90 billion yuan. After reading all this information, the protagonist froze in shock, asking if the system was some kind of hack. Chen was interested in what this system allows you to do. When he saw 2 balloons through the yellow plate, he immediately put his hand towards them. However, the woman screamed, calling the protagonist shameless. The girl shouted, telling Chen to watch her hands. He turned all red. The disgruntled girl crossed her hands in front of her and asked Chen what he was looking at. Then she said that he was definitely not right in his head. He looked carefully at that disgruntled girl and saw a system board next to her, on which there was information that her name was Zulil, age is 21, height is 165 centimeters, weight is 49. It has also been written that the attractiveness index of Zhu is 7 out of 10, and the disposition to the owner is less than 50 points. The protagonist was frozen looking at this system. However, a second later, the young man saw another sign explaining that as soon as the location parameter reaches 96 points, It will be possible to make a counterattack and Zhu will become a fan of the owner. Chen looked at this system board, asking himself many questions, among which was how to use this system and what it is about. Chen needs to spend this money on women, so he was surprised that he had up to 90 billion yuan in his system account. After that, a system board with the image of a black bank card appeared in front of his eyes, where the text was an explanation that all this amount is linked to this card, but he can only spend with women. It was also written there that when the card user gets a fan, a tenth of the amount spent will be credited to the owner's personal account and can be used at his request. In addition, the host can receive other rewards. Chen, realizing now that this is how things are, decided that then he could use this girl named Zhu as a test mouse. He smiled, but then quickly changed his expression to a gentler one and stretched his hands to his sides, addressing Zhu like a beautiful woman and asking her not to get angry. Chen also noted that what Zhu wanted today, everything is at Chen's expense. Immediately after these words, a notice appeared in front of Chen's eyes, which says that the implementation of the sticker system had been successfully completed. Zhu, on the other hand, looked at the young man without expressing any emotion. Another notification appeared for him, with the task that was Zhu's counterattack. It was also written there that the reward for completing this task is 10% of the system funds and 5 points of gain. In addition, there was an explanation on the board about the reinforcement points that can be used by the host to improve their characteristics, for example, physical characteristics, spiritual state, strength, agility, and so on. Suddenly, Zhu arched an eyebrow and smiled, starting to flood Chen with questions about how he pretends to be rich, saying once that he just wants to show off, and asked what the young man can actually do. The people around looked at Zhu, remembering that she is the beauty of the Faculty of Letters. These people also said they had heard that Zhu has an easy time spending other people's money, because somehow, Zhu only needed a few words for a man to spend 30,000 on her. The people around concluded that the protagonist seemed to have problems. He at this point smiled and told Zhu that if she doesn't try, she won't know. The girl smiled promptly and held out the phone with a QR code, saying that today was a good day. Then this girl asked the young man why not give all his classmates sweets at the buffet, and if Chen would help with the financial part of the matter. Zhu thought to herself that Chen was dressed like a beggar, but trying to show off in front of his beauty. So she privately decided that she would show Chen that he is a real shame. However, in the same second, a notification arrived on the girl's phone, saying that there was a receipt for her account in the amount of 50,000 yuan. The girl was dumbfounded, frozen in complete shock. The people around froze in shock and immediately whispered that Chen just took and transferred 50,000 as if it didn't cost anything. Another person whispered that this young man looks as insignificant as it gets. It turns out that now Shen is actually a very rich man. He smiled and told Zhu in a completely calm voice that 50,000 was not that much. She remained silent, trying to get away from the shock. On the other hand, the protagonist handed over his phone with a QR code and, opening a wide smile, asked the girl if that was enough to get it. Blushing with surprise, she asked herself if she had really made a mistake and that young man was really a rich man. Zhu smiled sneakily and decided how things would be. She approached the protagonist and said that he didn't need to worry. Shen's mouth opened in surprise. She approached and said in a seductive voice that they would go to the same place first. The girl was interested to see how long Chen would last. Approaching the luxury store called Gugo, Zhu said in a firm voice that she would like to clarify something. She reported that she was not a petty girl, but just wanted to understand how sincere and serious Shen was towards her. The protagonist smiled and silently provoked the girl to spend money, because the more she spends, the more he receives. Chen speaks in a completely calm voice that there is no problem, so the beautiful lady could choose whatever it was for herself. The protagonist speaks the phrase, "Tame your appetite and you will conquer human nature." He thinks Zhu is just a wonderful model to test this system. After entering the shop, Chen looked at all kinds of different things. Suddenly, the young man heard a familiar voice asking Wang if this bag suits her. Chen was shocked to realize that it was his ex Tong. At that moment, Tong turned her head to the side and looked at Chen in surprise. However, Zhu suddenly appeared and asked Chen if Tong was his former girl. Right after she says that it was the wrong time, the protagonist said no. On the contrary, it was very accurate. Zhu approached a female employee of this store and immediately asked if they had a spring parade bag for sale. The store employee smiled and said that the last one remains. However, the employee pointed her hand in Tong's direction and reported that another customer is trying on this bag. Tong cast a displeased look in Chen's direction, thinking to herself that the protagonist still hasn't left her alone. So Tong decided that now she would show Chen that a loser, as he is not a rival to Wang. So Tong smiled sweetly and called her new boyfriend, informing him that her birthday was coming up, and began to put that same bag in front of Wang's eyes, who was distracted on his phone screen. Wang asked about her birthday with dissatisfaction, and then reminded Tong that she had celebrated recently, to which Tong announced that it was not his birthday according to the lunar calendar, but according to the solar calendar it should be soon. Listening to this speech, Wang simply furrowed his brows and then smiled irritably. He asked Tong to listen to him carefully, then remembered that she knows he doesn't like petty girls, smiling even more angrily. He asked Tong if the girl was with him just for the money. Tong starts to sound cold. At the same moment, Zhu appeared and snatched Tong's bag. Zhu apologized, saying that if they didn't buy it, she would take it for herself. The protagonist, in turn, received a notification from the system that had received 20 points in favor of the young man. And when Chen paid for Zhu's scholarship, he immediately received another notification that he had received another 20 points in his favor. Zhu laughed happily holding his new bag, and Chen got another 20 points. As he held the black card in his hand, he thought to himself that this is the true power of money. The protagonist already has 60 points and realized that at this rate he would achieve the desired result. At this moment, the store employees were looking at Tong upset and bitter. She was discussing the situation very quietly. One of the employees turned to another, calling her Yahello, and said that she didn't understand why people who seem to have been born with a golden spoon in their mouths are so stingy with their women, and those who seem unremarkable are willing to spend such amounts. The other replied that the store director told the workers many times that it was not necessary to be biased against the guests, as the appearance can be misleading. At this moment, Zhu looked at Tong and laughed, saying that both the bag and the guy were taken by a better owner. Looking at Chen, who was looking at one of the display cases with bags, she broke into a sly smile, deciding privately that such a large fish shouldn't be lost. Immediately after, she made her sweetest expression and grabbed Chen by the hand, calling him dear, thanked him for the bag, admiring that Chen is so generous. Tong at this moment couldn't stand it. She watches the whole scene with tears in her eyes. After just a moment, Tong walked up to Chen and abruptly pushed him in the chest, screaming that this was too much. The protagonist cast a glance at Tong and smiled slightly, saying that they had just started. Then the girl started to run away from the store with tears in her eyes, and Wang ran after her. Chen received a notification from the system that a second object had been found. Immediately after that, he received detailed information from the system about the second object, namely Tong herself. In this window of the system, it was written that Tong is 21 years old, his height is 163 centimeters, and his weight is 49 kilograms. The attractiveness rating is 7, but the location for the owner is less than 10 points. The system explains to Chen that once the location parameter reached 96 points, it would be possible to make a counterattack, and Tong would become a fan of Master Chen. In addition, the young person will receive a reward for performing this maneuver in the form of 10% of the system bank at 20 points of earnings. Suddenly, Zhu approached and asked the young man in a sly voice if he was having a little fun. She announced that she wanted to play together, and then the beautiful lady clarified where they were going next. The prota repeated the question where they were going, and then smiled and confidently announced that they would naturally spend money. The guy's eyes turned into a golden symbol of yuan when the young man asked Zhu if a bag would be enough for her. Chen exclaimed in loud voice that I would never believe. After some time, they arrived at another store. Chen Yun pointed his index finger at various departments with similar things. The girl was very happy and smiling. Chen handed over her bank card and said that, in addition to these 2 clothes, everything else should also be wrapped. An employee with clothes in her hands froze and opened her mouth in shock. Zhu looked passionately at the way the young man was paying for his groceries, which even his eyes turned into hearts. The clerk smiled and turned to Chen, informing her that they would pack everything and deliver the selected items to the indicated address. Hearing this and holding a bunch of packages in her hands, the girl continues to exude a loving air, thinking that men with money are so attractive. At this point, Prota received a notification from the system that it had received 5 points of affection from Zhu for him. They quickly headed to the perfume store. After Chen paid for Zhu's choice with his card, he received a notification again that he got 5 points of favorability. Then they went to the cosmetics store, and after a few moments, Chen paid for the purchase again. He received 5 more favorability points from Zhu. A few moments later, they were back at the clothing store, and when Chen put the bank card back in, he received 5 more points. After a certain period of time, tired and smiling, Zhu thought that was enough, and catching her breath told Chen that if they continue to buy like this, she is afraid that all of this won't fit in her apartment. The protagonist, hearing this, immediately took out his phone and said that this was not a problem, as he would buy an apartment for Zhu. While he was counting something into a calculator on his phone, adding up to quite large amounts. Zhu froze, frightened by such a statement, became nervous and said in a trembling and uncertain voice that somehow this was not good, because Chen had already spent so much money, and this was only their first meeting. She smiled nervously, and said she just wanted to make a joke. In the same second, Chen received a notification from the system that Zhu's disposition had dropped by 5 points. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, concluding privately that the young man seemed to have scared Zhu. After thinking for a while, he made another conclusion, In fact, if he was told that they would buy a house worth $1 million, then the young man would also experience some inconvenience. Suddenly, Chen approached her and smiled, saying her name and that Zhu was studying in the 3rd year of the Institute of Arts. Then he reported that she is 21 years old, her height is 165 centimeters, and her weight is 49 kilograms. Also, Zhu's favorite color is black. The girl froze and blushed slightly, covering her mouth with her hand. The protagonist went on to say that her favorite cuisine is Korean, and the girl's zodiac sign is Capricorn. In addition, Chen also said about the size 37 of Zhu's shoes and that she loves horror movies, but is more afraid to walk down the street alone at night. Chen asked Zhu a question, if he would behave so recklessly if the young man didn't like all of this. Then he turned to the clerk and asked if they had a card in the store, and then firmly replied that he would reload this card with 500,000. Chen pointed his palm at Zhu and told the employee that the next time this girl comes to your store, recommend the best for her. The clerk immediately agreed and politely asked the customers to wait a while. The protagonist turned to Zhu and said in a confident voice that this savings card was for her, in order to soften the impression after a failure of joking about buying an apartment that scared her. Hearing all this, the girl instantly melted and blushed deeply. Chen approached her ear and whispered the words that if the girl felt uncomfortable, then she could offer him something interesting in return. He blushed even more and abruptly pushed Chen's face with his hand, calling him shameless. However, no matter what she said, the protagonist received a notification from the system that Zhu's affection for him had increased by more than 30 points. Seeing all of this, the shop workers admired Chen so much that even their eyes were turned into hearts. The workers whispered loudly enough that this guy was so simple in appearance, yet so rich. In addition, the workers noted that Chen is not only rich, but also very generous, because the young man cares a lot about his wife. Hearing all these whispers, Chen cracked a smile, thinking to himself that if you have money, no matter who you are and no matter how you behave, they will forgive you and let you get away with it. Suddenly, Zhu made a strange expression and said that Chen had bought her so many gifts, then asked why the young man didn't think about himself, to which Chen stretched out his hands to his sides and briefly hinted that there was no money. Zhu smiled and said that then it was her turn to give Chen a gift. She thought to herself that if she wants to catch this big fish for a long time, then she should invest. After some time, they were already in another clothing store. Zhu chose completely different clothes. After choosing the beautiful and right clothes, Zhu took the young man to the barber shop, where Chen was carefully trimmed by the barber who was following all of Zhu's instructions. After some time, he came out of the fitting room completely transformed. Zhu was really pleased, and Chen received a notification from the system that Zhu's affection for him had increased by another 5 points. The girl blushed deeply and covered her mouth with her hands, thinking to herself that Chen had become so attractive after the girl only had to dress him up a little. The employee who was standing behind Zhu also froze at Chen's beauty. Meanwhile, he received several other notifications that Zhu's affection for him had increased by 5 more points. The protagonist blushed and entered a model pose, asking Zhu about how she liked her outfit and if this arc looked a little weird. The girl stood silently admiring such an attractive young man. Chen thought to himself that he was already an adult, but this was the first time he had come across something like this. He concluded that he didn't need to spend money on it. Zhu ran her index finger over Chen's chin and pierced the young man with a flirtatious look, saying that there was nothing strange and that she thinks she and Chen are now fine together. The girl blew a kiss and informed him that she was so happy today, then thanked him, saying that for a moment she thought she had fallen in love. When they said goodbye and went home, the young man received a notification from the system that Zhu's affection for him had reached 68 points. When the protagonist entered his dorm, he loudly informed his roommates that he was back. Hearing Chen Yuan's voice, his roommates froze in shock and opened their mouths. One of these roommates shouted loudly, invoking his god, then turned to Chen and asked about what the young man was doing all day and what he was wearing. The protagonist, without taking his eyes off his cell phone, with a slight smile on his face, announced that he was on a date with Zhu Liu. A guy put his hand to the side with displeasure and asked if the protagonist hadn't resolved anything with Tong and was already with Zhu, pressing his glasses to the bridge of his nose. The second roommate reminded Chen that Zhu is the first beauty in the Faculty of Arts, and clarified about what would happen to Chen Yuan if he was abandoned again. Suddenly, another roommate put his hand on Chen's shoulder and with a smile on his face said to listen to his friends, who say that this girl is not accessible to him. The protagonist was covered in beads of sweat cold and smiled faintly, saying words of gratitude to his roommates for their advice. After some time, Chen was looking on his phone at Tong's messages, who wrote that if Chen really hates her, then they should just erase each other's friends. Chen smiled as he looked at Tong's messages and concluded that fortunately Tong's manipulations don't work anymore. However, if they remove each other from friends, then Chen won't be able to earn extra money from Tong through the system. Coming out of these reflections, Chen looked again at the question Tong asked about him hating her. The prota then asked Tong about how she could talk like that, He reminded her that she also knows that she is special to him. Then Tong sent a message to Chen saying that she was with Wang, not because she needed his money, but because her mother was sick and the girl needed 50,000 for treatment. After seeing Tong's message, in the same second Chen transferred 50,000 to the girl's account. Seeing this, the girl screamed in shock and surprise all over the dormitory, not believing her eyes. With a strange arch of her eyebrows, Tong informed her roommates that she barely mentioned it, and Chen immediately transferred the money. Listening to this, a surprised roommate approached Tong and asked about who this rich man who was spreading so much money was. The roommate believed it was really Huang. Tong immediately furrowed his brows and said to go to hell with Wang, because he couldn't even buy her a simple bag, and said in an angry voice that it was Chen who transferred the money to her. The surprised roommate opened her mouth and asked about Chen, clarifying that Tong had just broken up with him. The roommate continued to wonder if an idiot as poor as Chen really has that much money. Tong furrowed his brows and immediately began tapping his fingers on his phone, thinking that it really was his mistake. The girl decided that she needed to ask the prota directly. Chen at the same time received a notification from the system that Tong's affection for him had increased by another 5 points, and the girl began to flood Chen with her messages. She asked Chen what all this meant and how he got so much money. From what happened today in the store, Tong immediately stopped and abruptly asked her ex-boyfriend in a message about his relationship with Zhu, and then the girl asks if Chen had really bought the bag for Zhu. With no answer, she decides to ask one last question, if Chen Yun was really born with a golden spoon in his mouth. After being silent for a while since Chen didn't respond, Tong continued to write messages about wanting fried pork. After that, she sadly asked the young man if he didn't love her anymore. The girl continued to write to Chen without stopping. However, as soon as Chen saw 15 unread messages, the young man immediately clicked on the chat settings and selected a button called Do Not Disturb. With a slight dissatisfaction, he looked away, thinking that Tong was too talkative, but Zhu wasn't so hasty in this regard. The protagonist then returned to his cell phone, wondering where else he could spend a lot of money on a woman. After seeing the app icon with an image of a shark, Chen abruptly realized that he could try it with the live stream. Having entered this program, he met and aired for a beautiful girl named ᴄᴏᴘᴘύʀɪԼՂᴛ, who with her sweet voice reported that she would be online for only an hour. Hence, fans should hurry up with the GIF. Chen entered the broadcast room with the nickname Lone Wolf and immediately started reading the comments where many fans praised ᴄᴏᴘᴘύʀɪЛՂᴛ. One of the commentators with the nickname of Mind reported that his wife found out that he was watching Zio, and now they are divorcing. Commentator Philin asked Zio not to deceive his subscribers, while people with the nicknames Sakura and Chicken were making copies. The Lone Wolf, or rather, Chen wrote that he wanted to be friends with Zio. Seeing Chen's comment, Mind immediately asked the young man if it was funny to him that Chen was some kind of new name. With such requests, Zio immediately warned the Lone Wolf that it would cost him a handsome penny. Since $1 million is far from the limit, Kakaro called Chen a fool and said that he wouldn't play 100,000. After that trio of commentators started laughing at the text. Looking at his cell phone, Chen thinks to himself that $1 million is much more than a bag, so he selected a rocket from the many gifts and sent it to ᴄᴏᴘᴘύʀɪЛՂᴛ. The girl folded the gesture of the heart from her hands and thanked the Lone Wolf for the rocket. Zio spoke words of love to the Lone Wolf, and then froze in shock and widened her eyes with her mouth slightly open. She continued to stand and watching as a whole 100 missiles were sent to her. After seeing 100 missiles, the same commentators of Zio herself froze in shock, realizing that these 100 missiles equal a whole 1 million. A few moments later, the commenters started writing to the stream chat again. A commenter with the nickname Plane wrote that Chen had spent a lot of money, so in that same chat he said he had a rich man here and then apologized and said he was mistaken. Then a commentator with the nickname Encantado appeared, who called him daddy and asked him to punish him. The last one was the same Kakarot who wrote that he was nothing of the sort either. Kakarot asked Chen Yun to write him something. Continuing to read ᴄᴏᴘᴘύʀɪЛՂᴛ's chat, the protagonist concluded that these commentators are really snobbish. He then smiled sneakily and asked Zio to let him please her a little more. Immediately after that, Chen began to poke his finger at the missiles again, choosing from the amount of up to 900 pieces. A moment later, Zio received a notification that the Lone Wolf had pleased her with rocket. Immediately after that, Zio's entire screen was filled with those same missiles. A few moments later, an employee of the stream's office abruptly burst into his boss's office and shouted loudly that the incredible had happened. Inside, the employee shouted to the boss the information that some unknown rich man had just donated Zio 10 million. That boss hearing this, he even spat out all the water he was drinking out of shock. Then this man made a serious expression on his face and asked the employee if he was a fraud. The boss was very surprised. He believed that once someone gives 10 million, it is really money laundering. At this moment in the streamer's bathroom, 3 girls were discussing something very loud. One of these stream's girls was blushing, screaming for the rest of her friends to come to her soon. Then this girl began to loudly inform the others that the young man was a lone wolf. The girl clarified that this is the richest, so all these girls must write to him soon. The other girls also turned red. One girl started screaming that the lone wolf had transferred 10 million to ᴄᴏᴘᴘᴘ. The other girl said that some of these missiles would cover her monthly salary. At this time, the proto was looking at his phone and seeing a lot of friend requests from different girls. Zio froze, covering her mouth with her hands. She even wondered if this was a dream, and if she had really received 10 million. Immediately after that, Zio squeezed her cheek tightly and concluded that she was in pain. Suddenly, she heard a rustling noise. Turning to the side, she saw one of the workers with a sign in his hands, on which it was written that his boss said that it was necessary to put the lone wolf into circulation. There was also a red note on the sign that the boss was giving Zio an extra 10%. Seeing this, the girl smiled surreptitiously, thinking to herself that she didn't need it anymore, because it was like she had won a big fish. Zio's face changed drastically, and she winked at the camera, saying a big thank you to the lone wolf. Zio smiled sweetly and told the protagonist to send her a message, which she would thank Chen appropriately. A few moments later, Chen received a personal message from Zio herself, who addressed him like a brother and asked if he was here. With the next message, she announced that her transmission would last another 5 minutes. Not receiving a response from the young man, she sent a message again, but now with a polite request to respond to it. However, at that point, the proto had already fallen asleep and muttered something to himself about not having his sister do it. The next day, some college students were looking at hot news, among which first at the top was a story about a mysterious rich man who spent 10 million on the Shark app. It was also written there that the identity of this rich man still remains a mystery. In second place, at the top, were the daily discussions. And in third place at the top, there was the information that the auctioneer had placed the goods at a fabulous price. In fourth and fifth place, there were already lesser-known articles about a walk in tapas and a full review, but also about Uncle Gu, who managed to make his dream come true. The students shouted that others would prefer to look at the fact that someone spent 10 million on an app of Shark Live yesterday. The same roommate with glasses did not believe that this money was actually spent. The colleague said that in his city it would be possible to buy several apartments for this money. The roommate was amazed, thinking what he would do if he had so much money. Chen opened his eyes, hearing all this conversation on the side. Another roommate at this moment said that he hopes that today he will have a dream in which he will be the richest man. After some time, Chen was brushing his teeth and thinking a lot about the fact that yesterday he spent so much money and the system didn't connect with ᴄᴏᴘᴘᴘ. Chen continued to look closely at the system boards with information about the related fans, among which there were only Zhu and Tong. Poking at the Shark app icon, the protagonist wondered if it really demanded a personal meeting or the young man's money was wasted. Chen entered the dialogue list and was shocked when he saw many unread messages from different girls. One of them said hello, calling Chen her brother, and then reported that she was a cute little girl. After that, she asked if Chen would like to meet. The next girl introduced herself as Lang Yang and said she was happy to meet him. The third one wrote down her parameters. After her, there was another girl who politely asked Chen to add her as a friend. The last one was Zio, who sent emojis and asked if Chen would confirm his friend request. Seeing all of this, he was covered in cold sweat drops from shock due to how many personal messages were sent to him. At this moment, Chen Yuan's roommates were about to leave for somewhere. One of them was panting with joy, saying he was anxious. The roommate with glasses began to rush his friend. Chen turned and called his roommates, asking what they were doing and why they didn't invite him with them. The roommate turned around and informed them that they were going to class. Then that young man with a serious expression said that today is an open lesson and they want to appreciate Jia beauty. With the adjustment of his glasses, the second roommate began to talk about how Chen had rushed ahead of them. The other roommate asked Chen if he was coming or not. The protagonist froze for a few moments, remembering Jia appearance. After a certain period of time, the young people came to an open class and looked at the same girl, named Jia. Zhao is the student president of Hunan University, and also every guy's dream. In addition, Jia plays the piano, is president of the ballet troupe, and has a second class in fencing. It's the incredible appearance and many talents that make her an illusory dream of all guys. The protagonist was thinking to himself what a beauty from Hunan University named Jia has been keeping all this time, which no one has been able to achieve in 3 years of study. At this moment, the girls who were sitting behind Chen were whispering a lot. The first girl in love asked about who this handsome young man was, to which the second girl in love asked if Chen had been transferred from another group, since she hadn't seen this handsome man before. Hearing all of this, Chen smiled and kept thinking that since Jia is so unapproachable, this is a great opportunity to get good money back. Tong and her roommate were also sitting. This roommate imagines out loud that it was a lie. According to her, Chen had changed so much in these 2 days. The last question the roommate had asked Tong was if the prota had dressed so much to impress her. Tong froze in surprise, but then blushed and smiled shyly, agreeing with her roommate, more with uncertainty in her voice. In the midst of this confusion, Tong reported that they are fine. The protagonist at this point received several notifications from the system that Tong's affection for him had increased by another 10 points. Taking a look back, Chen laughed displeased, concluding that he just had to get dressed, and Tong's attitude towards him improved. Chen believed that Tong was actually a shallow woman, so he looked at the system's nameplate, asking himself if in any case he could add Zhao Yuki to the system. Suddenly, Chen heard a loud shout from one of the young men, who offered to show everyone how he would conquer the beautiful Zhao Yuki. The protagonist stood there watching those young men. One of them leveled up with a smile on his face, and said to look carefully at the fact that now Zhao Yuki would fall in love with him. Meanwhile, his friends happily teased him, calling him boss and telling him to go ahead. This young man immediately approached Zhao Yuki and called her baby in a flirtatious voice, asking her to share her number. Observing all of this, Chen cursed with displeasure at the fact that the girl was being carried right before his eyes. Zhao Yuki froze in surprise. That young man smiled and began to get closer and closer to her. However, this young man was called by an angry girl who was sitting next to Zhao and asked about what this guy was doing. That young man completely ignored. Now, the man continued to flirt with the girl, telling Zhao Yuki that they would get to know each other for a while and start dating, and that's why he didn't have time to break up. While Zhao's classmate grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and pulled him close to her with a sharp pencil. That girl, whose name is Woozy, looked at that boy very angry and calling him a brat. Questioning what he had done to himself, making an even crueler face, Woozy firmly told Zhao Yuki not to touch them. That young man was covered with drops of cold sweat and horror, and casting a nervous glance at the sharp pencil, began to say in a trembling voice that this was a misunderstanding, and that the young man just wanted to join the student council. Also, that young man with a nervous voice reminded Woozy that Zhao Yuki is the president, and he just wanted to ask for advice. Getting even more nervous, the boy said that Woozy had got it all wrong. However, a second later, this young man was already injured by that sharp pencil and howled in pain, arching his eyebrows and irritated. Woozy said in an angry voice that she didn't think so, and also noted that this was some kind of stupid excuse to pick up a girl, so she told this guy to get out of here. After breaking up with that young man, Woozy says that it was even funny, citing as an example that it was like a frog flaunting in front of a swan. Zhao Yuki began to reassure his roommate Woozy, assuring him that everything was fine. Woozy continued to growl, saying that this young man had annoyed her. At this moment, Chen approached them. The young man smiled and turned to Zhao Yuki, saying that he would also like to add her as a friend. Then Woozy growled in annoyance again, asking again if another had come and outraged at the fact that there is no end to these fans. Zhao Yuki is completely standing still looking at Chen. The rest of the students immediately whispered, asking what kind of hype it was today. The protagonist smiled and held out his phone with the WeChat QR code, asking Zhao Yuki if it was possible. One of the students exclaimed in a whisper that this guy, referring to Chen, is so brave that he is not afraid to lose face in front of the whole group. Another student wondered where Chen has this self-confidence, and then he started talking about. At this point, Woozy smiled and reported that this young man was at least more handsome. With a laugh, Woozy asked Chen if the young man also wanted to join the student club. The protagonist stretched out his hands to the sides and smiled sweetly, informing him that he wasn't very interested in all these student movements. Woozy gets annoyed. She crossed her hands in front of her and asked Chen what he needed Zhao Yuki about. Chen laughs and asks if it's not obvious, then put on an innocent expression and announced that he wanted to hit Zhao Yuki. The girl blushed and hesitantly pulled her hand towards Chen. On the other hand, Woozy was deeply angry. The students around began to scream in shock, asking if Chen was seriously doing this. Some students shouted that the guy was crazy, and one of the students even offered to look at where Chen's confidence would be when the young man cried after he was abandoned. Meanwhile, Zhao smiled slightly and took out his phone, agreeing to try and meet Chen. Tong, seeing all this, pulled his eyebrows to the tip of his nose and pursed his lips. Her surprised roommate opened her mouth slightly and turned to Tong, asking if Chen wasn't her small dog. The roommate was genuinely perplexed, wondering aloud if Tong and Chen really had any problems. Chen at this moment was smiling, thinking to himself that the desire for beauty is no stranger to anyone. So why hide it? Behind Chen there were 3 heartbroken youths who were crying because of his success, and one of them started crying loudly because his goddess Zhao Yuki would take this piglet. One young man wondered who said that simplicity is bad, because sometimes the most obvious is also the most effective. Chen immediately received a notification from the system that a new target had been found. The system also reported that Zhao Yuki's current position, and reported that his disposition is 0 points. Chen smiled happily that it worked. After some time, his roommates turned to the prota, telling him that he was in a good mood today, because the young man even got Zhao Yuki's number. Yes, one of these roommates even reported that Chen had changed quite a bit lately. One of the roommates, who is large, smiled and asked Chen if the young man would ask Yuki to introduce them to his beautiful friends if everything went well for him. The protagonist blushed slightly and said in an embarrassed voice that he hadn't done anything yet. Then Chen said that Yuki is the most beautiful girl in the university, so these young people shouldn't talk nonsense. Suddenly, someone called out to Chen, calling him a smug fool. The protagonist turned around and saw the same young man who unsuccessfully asked to talk to Zhao Yuki. So this guy put his hands on his hips and told the boy he was smart. Chen smiled and asked these guys if they wanted to embarrass themselves even more. The roommate asked about the fact that Chen was so self-confident that he even decided to start a war. The redhead rubbed his chin with his hand, concluding that it really did. The bespectacled roommate opened his mouth in surprise, wondering if there would be a fight now or not. That angry young man immediately attacked Chen by growling a question about what he had just said. Then that embittered young man started to shout that he was going to finish off the protagonist. After that, he started to shout again and ask about what Chen thought of himself. At this moment, two of his friends were trying to contain that mad young man with anger, shouting for him to calm down. And one of them grabbed the guy by the leg and asked if the man forgot what was said at the police station. Remembering that the guy started shouting that if they fight again, they will be fined. Chen, looking at this, laughed and said, "What a shame." Chen suddenly froze when he saw Zhu in front of him. The girl said that the young man was so slow, and she had been waiting for him for so long. Upon seeing Zhu Lil, all the young people around went crazy, repeating together the words that Zhu Lil is the first beauty of the Faculty of Letters, and the sixth in the ranking of beauties of the entire university, nicknamed the Storm of Heterosexuals. The protagonist, however, smiled slightly, and said that it was foolish to do such a thing, so he tilted his head to one side and in a sweet voice, announced that if Zhu Lil allowed it, then he would treat this beauty to dinner as an apology. The girl pulled her hair back and smiled sweetly, saying that it was not worth doing that, and in a flirtatious voice asked if the young man liked the way she looked. Zhu also noticed that Chen had bought all these things. The young man replied that everything looks great in Zhu and this bag looks just amazing. Tong was hiding in the crowd. Hearing all this, she clenched her fists and pursed her lips in overflowing anger. Zhu took Chen's arm and asked if it was true and then said that people liked it too. The protagonist briefly replied that of course it was true. Following with his eyes, that aggressive young man clenched his fist and began to burst into tears. The young man aloud reported that he did not understand at all what was wrong with him. However, the young man didn't even have time to finish when he heard a female scream. The girl was screaming loudly, asking about what was wrong with her. That young man looked to the sides and was surprised by the origin of the scream, asking if anyone had really read his thoughts. Turning around, this young man saw Tong in bitter tears. The man asks why she keeps screaming. Tong says that she had been just like Zhu before. Tong genuinely didn't understand what was wrong with her. After a certain period of time, Zhu turned to Chen holding her pencil-drawn portrait and informed her that she had a gift for the young man. Chen looked carefully at the piece of paper where the portrait was drawn. She went on to say that she stayed up late to do this. Furrowing her brows slightly, she spoke resentfully, informing her that if he threw away this drawing, she would not forgive him. The prota was paralyzed, realizing that this was the first gift from a girl in his entire life. Seeing this surprised expression on Chen's face, Zhu smiled sweetly and asked if he liked it. He then lowered his head completely, addressing Zhu in a stern tone and asking if it was all just bait. The prota concluded to himself that as soon as he passed gifts to her, Zhu thought of details of how to catch him. Chen, casting a glance from his red eyes, he smiled and said that unfortunately he was no longer the same as before. Zhu was covered in drops of cold sweat, as she was imagining that Chen really didn't like the gift, since he doesn't seem particularly happy. Chen, on the other hand, raised his eyebrows and asked Zhu with slight disdain as to why he needed it. Thereof, the girl immediately turned nervous and deeply blushed, saying in a trembling voice that she had painted this portrait late at night, and if Chen didn't like it. He quickly took the portrait in his hands and then approached Zhu, looking directly into his eyes. The girl blushed even more, opening her mouth slightly. He smiled and took the drawing from his hand. The girl began to yell at Chen, calling him an idiot and saying that he had scared her. Soon after, ordered him to give her the drawing. The protagonist makes it clear that he would not give him the drawing. He promised that he would take this portrait for himself and keep it with his family. Grabbing Zhu by the wrist, Chen approached her again and addressed her by name, informing her that he likes her more than the drawing. The girl then looked away and cursed at him, concluding that Chen was flirting. Right at the same moment, the protagonist received a notification from the system that Zhu increased her affection for him by 5 more points. Seeing this notification, Chen smiled strangely silently, asking Zhu if she wanted to tease him. Then, Chen also addressed her in private, calling her dear, and said that he needed her just so that the young man would have more money. Suddenly, a young man appeared, who shouted Zhu's name and abruptly pushed Chen aside. Standing between them, this young man called Zhu by name again, and asked a question about her having arranged with her best friend to do her nails. Then this young man began to angrily ask Zhu about who this man was, referring to Chen clenching his fists. That young man began to angrily and nervously assume that Zhu and Chen were getting their Shenra nails done, and now they are coming out ahead. The guy points his index finger in the direction of the protagonist. The young man started to flood Zhu with several questions about the fact that Chen has money, and that's why Zhu allows herself to be hugged. The guy started screaming that he had been competing for Zhu for so long and this beautiful girl had never even allowed herself to be touched by the hand. The protagonist realized that this boy is a fervent fan of Zalil. They also reflected that this kind of behavior was very familiar to him. Full of anger, Zalil shouted loudly at this boy with glasses, asking about who he was, then angrily began to ask about what business this boy had. Whether Zhu had a partner or not, he had nothing to do. At the same moment, Chen approached that young man and politely greeted him, introducing himself by his real name, then smiled slightly and asked what that young man's name was and how long he had been humiliated. Zhu was completely surprised and couldn't understand what was happening here. The bespectacled young man clenched his fist and announced, in a trembling and uncertain voice, that his name was this Wangu, and announced that he was also a student at the Faculty of Arts, and also that he had been trying to take care of Zalil for 6 months. After hearing this, Chen strongly realizes that it was a lost child. Pushing his hair back with his hand, Chen laughed, saying that it reminds him of someone, because once Chen had run after a girl for 3 years. After that, he told Wangu that the young man used to work 4 jobs and 8 steamed buns. Wangu's eyes were bulging and frozen, surprising slightly. The protagonist smiled slightly and reported that in the end this girl still preferred to get into someone else's Mercedes. Wangu asked surprised about how, because that's already too much. However, Chen approached Wangu and said that those who abandon them also motivate them to become better. Placing his hand on Wangu's shoulder, Chen said that a real man would definitely have a decent woman. Then he pointed his hand to the side, telling Wangu in a confident voice to go back to his dorm room and forget about Zalil. Chen also noted that when Wangu succeeds, Zhu will definitely see and regret his choice. Tears flowed from Wangu's eyes, and the young man himself clenched his fists and looked at the protagonist with admiration, informing him that he had calmed him down. Wangu admirably promised that he would definitely become stronger and make a lot of money. Zhu in turn smiled nervously, asking herself what was going on here, then turned to Chen and reported that Wangu was just her friend. Zhu herself never thought that Chen would cast a stern look at her. He called her by name, saying in a cold tone in his voice that the young man didn't care about this girl's past. Then Chen tore the girl's drawing in half, and said in a firm voice that he thought Zhu didn't respect himself or Chen himself. After tearing the gift portrait into small pieces and throwing it into the sky, the protagonist informed her that the girl could continue using the savings card he gave yesterday. After that, the protagonist started to leave, throwing this girl the last words that the girl says that he needs to learn to communicate with people, or else it is better not to see them. When he left her, he smiled sneakily, asking if Zhu would put up with such an attitude towards himself, and what this girl would do. The protagonist was eager to know what she was going to do. In Zhu's mind, a big drop fell to the ground, remembering the moments of the past together with Chen. The girl thought that for the first time someone was so special to her, shedding bitter tears. She cried loudly and said in a trembling voice that Chen really liked her, but she had screwed herself. Then, at the same time, Chen received a notification from the system that Zhu's affection for him had increased by another 5 points. The protagonist just thought it was funny, concluding that apparently the worse you treat a woman, the more she loves you. He confidently realized that he had grown up and had finished with Zalil. Then it was time to leave. He took out his phone and was happy when he saw that Yahello was doing a live broadcast, so he immediately went to the broadcast, which was hosted by Yahello. As soon as the broadcast loaded, he saw her. Yuki waves his hand to his fans and greets them. Yahello then introduced himself as Kiki and announced that his specialty was music dance. The girl said that she is still learning how to interact with fans on this platform, so she asked them to be careful. The protagonist looked carefully at his cell phone screen and even blushed slightly, thinking it was cute. Shen also wondered if it could be that Yuki only looks so cold, but actually this girl is quite open. The protagonist realizes that only 314 people out of 2,700 were watching the live stream. He genuinely didn't understand why there were so few people. At the same moment, Chen received a cheerful message from Zio. She sent a smiley face with a kiss and said she was happy for Fleece. Chen, panting, asked Zio about who she was. The girl reminded him that he had just given her a bunch of rockets yesterday, and today he doesn't remember anymore. The protagonist sends a message back with a loud laugh, saying that he was just joking, then asked Zio Amir if she had free time, and then informed her that they needed to meet. The girl in response talks about how impatient Chen was. Immediately after that, Zio reported that she was too busy for the time being. Shen told her to forget about it, to which Zio told Chen not to get angry, promising that she would dance for him today. At this point, the proto was annoyed when he realized that Zio still wanted him for money. Chen spent so much money, but until now there wasn't even a system notification about the connection with her. Chen thought it would be better if he gave all this money to President Yahello. Suddenly, Chen received a notification from the app that the presenter he is following is participating in the battle. After looking closely, Chen saw that the app was asking the young man to support the presenter with the nickname Baby Kick. Suddenly, Zhao Yuki froze when he saw that he was about to participate in a battle with someone. At this moment, the excited Woozi sincerely hoped that this battle wouldn't be with someone big. The Prota at this moment smiled when he saw that this battle would be with President Zhao. He thought that this battle would be interesting to watch. Suddenly, Zio appeared before Chen's eyes with a sweet smile on her face. With an innocent expression on her face, she announces that she accidentally called a new girl into battle. Zio believed that victory was in his pocket. He fascinated commentators with nicknames who continued to write the same thing as in the last broadcast, discussing about wives and divorces, and also how beautiful Zio is. The Prota saw all of this with a sly smile and reported that it was very difficult to predict the winner here. He genuinely thinks that Zio and Zhao Yuki were quite an interesting set of circumstances. Zai began to draw attention to herself with the words that she thinks little Kiki shouldn't even try, because Zio's viewers are so much better. She added that in addition, she is supported by such an influential person as a lone wolf. Immediately, the public became more active in the comments. The commentator with the nickname Archie asked about the lone wolf, clarifying that this is the only one who spent 10 million yesterday. The viewer with the nickname Jimmy immediately asked questions about the fact that this is the main type. The Midnight viewer simply agreed with Zio's words and apologized to little Kiki, saying that Zio has wonderful big eyes, and he is now for her. Zio laughed, recalling the dialogue with Chen about the live meeting, concluding to herself that according to her experience of catching big fish, Chen must already be on the hook. Upon seeing the huge gift rocket that was nearby, Zio immediately made a flirtatious expression on his face and turning to the lone wolf thanked him. However, after just a moment, Zio froze in horror when he saw that the missiles were not sent to her, but to Zhao Yuki. Zio shouted a question in shock as to why the lone wolf sent 1,000 missiles to Yuki. Zhao Yuki, on the other hand, immediately opened his mouth in shock. Woozi, on the other hand, shouted that a total of 1,000 missiles was simply incredible. Zio asked the question again, why didn't the lone wolf send those 1,000 missiles to her? Suddenly, the girl heard a rustling noise and turned to see an animated, sweaty worker with a sign in his hands. On that sign, it was written that the boss demanded an explanation from Zio, so she turned to the camera and apologized to the viewers, saying that she had things to do. A second later, the image of a cup of coffee appeared resting on the screen. Commentator Jimmy sent a text laughing and said, "Shame." Archie also wrote that the lone wolf is really amazing, as he forced Zio to close his mouth. Lee also wrote that the girl said that lone wolf was her page. And the protagonist himself immediately started laughing. He was at this point looking at his phone and thinking that he could give gifts to both of them. In his mind, Chen asked if Zio really wanted to play with him. Considering that Zhao Yuki continues to conduct his broadcast, Chen addressed her as President Xiao and said that he spent a lot of money, so Zhao Yuki shouldn't disappoint. After a certain period of time, the shark employee again broke into his boss's office, shouting that something terrible had happened. This employee shouted and waved his hands, reporting something about that rich man with the nickname Lone Wolf. The boss abruptly jumped out of his seat and asked if Chen had stolen the 10 million, and then began to shout the question that this guy was definitely not some oil tycoon. At that moment in the streamer's bathroom, the girl screamed, probably in shock, that the richest lone wolf had transferred 10 million to the girl who played the piano. The two girls around him stared at the screen of the cell phone in shock. One of these streamers asked, surprised, if the lone wolf was in the mood for music today. Another girl turned to her classmate named Salai and told her to upload her triangle. After a period of time, Zhao Yuki watched the news on the website, seeing at the top of the hottest news that the mysterious rich man had again stolen 10 million. Therefore, the new presenter Yuki is first in the ranking. Woozi was shouting loudly, addressing Yuki and telling her to look at the fact that today's broadcast ranks first in all trends. The cheerful face of the Woozi shouted that Yuki had become popular and would now be an internet celebrity. The girl opened her mouth in shock again and blushed deeply. However, suddenly Zhao Yuki put on a serious expression and made an unsatisfied noise about the possibility of becoming an internet celebrity. She asked a question about what really makes men happy on the internet, saying she wouldn't say this is a particularly attractive prosperous. Yuki then asked Woozi if she understood that a career is the most important thing for a woman. Yuki believed that a woman should be independent both financially and in all other aspects, both of which Woozi smiled and told her to stop lecturing. Then she smiled sneakily and asked Yuki to honestly say if the girl knew this rich man who showered her with gifts. But the woman turned on her side and shouted the words she had already said 1,000 times no. Woozi got a little nervous and asked Yuki not to get angry and said that she is just too curious. Yuki made a satisfied expression again and said that this lone wolf had actually sent her many gifts. Yuki decided that she needed to thank him. Woozi, removing the circular lamp, was covered with drops of cold sweat, amazed by Yuki's abrupt change in mood. Worried, Woozy wondered who just said she wasn't amused by such a prospect. Yuki said one thing and did another. Suddenly, Yuki screamed loudly, which scared Woozy a lot, who asked what happened. Zhao Yuki turned to Woozy and said that she could know who it was. Looking closely at Chen's chat, the girls saw that his nickname was Lone Wolf. With a trembling voice of surprise, Zhao Yuki said that it appeared to be Chen Yuan.